So firstly, yeah, I'm going to speak a little bit about net zero and what's been happening, but then obviously get on to the need to develop and support people, because obviously it's going to be people who are going to have to put in place the changes and make a difference in terms of how we're going to get to net zero. Just if you're not aware about IEMA, so we're the professional body for people who work in environment and sustainability roles. We have about 18,500 members in over 100 countries around the world. And they're very much leading on sustainability in different sectors. So we have members in, as well as kind of extractives and infrastructure and construction. We also have members in financial services, in retail, so right across the whole value chain. And we provide that professional recognition through our qualifications. We support people in terms of enhancing their own personal skills and capability. We also work closely with different parts of government to help to set that policy agenda so that we can harness the expertise within our membership to help to change the rules of the game so that we can accelerate to a more sustainable future. So very, very similar in many respects, I guess, to RSM, but in a slightly different context. So what I was going to cover in this session today was firstly just a reminder, if anything, if we do need a reminder about the scale of the challenge that we face in going through that net zero transition, and really how fast we need to go if we're going to really meet the objectives that the global community has set through the Paris Agreement. Then I'm going to look at green jobs and skills and how organisations can start to make that skills transition and align that to some of the net zero transition as well. And then obviously, well, not obviously, but I do also want to reflect on this, what we call all jobs greener, but a whole economy approach. Because I think, the key thing to note is that whereas there will be certain sectors which will be really important for the transition in terms of whether we're looking in energy, etc. But the reality is that every organisation is going to have to go through a net zero transition, however big or small, and therefore it will need people in all types of organisation and all sizes of organisation to be able to play their role in helping their organisations make that shift. So that whole economy approach is going to be really important. And then finally, we'll finish with Q&A. So if you want to put questions into the chat, etc., we'll pick those up at the end. It's also worth saying we are working very closely here in the UK with different parts of government on the skills agenda as it relates to not just net zero transition, but wider environment and sustainability goals. So earlier this week, I was involved with the Department for Education on their sustainability and climate change strategy for the whole of the education sector, right through from primary age groups into higher and further education and lifelong learning. So that's really interesting to see how that's making a big shift. Also worked very closely with the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, a lot of work that we did on the Environment Act, which is now on the statute book, but I think I've been working on that for about 3 or 4 years, as that bill made it into Parliament and then through Parliament, and now we're focusing on what has to happen to implement that. And then working with the Department for Business on net zero and other parts of government as well. So I think from our perspective, it's really interesting to see how this comes together. And one of the things that we do here constantly, whether it's working with government, whether it's working with our own members and our corporate partners, whether it's working with some of the sector bodies like the Food and Drink Federation or the British Retail Consortium or Make UK in the manufacturing sector, is that they all recognise that there is a big challenge in terms of developing the skills and capability to meet the expectations and the challenge that's being faced. It's something that we highlighted quite strongly in our submission to a select committee inquiry last year, and it was pleasing to see that the comments that we made in our written submission, and also I appeared before the select committee, made it through into a whole series of their recommendations about what has to happen if we're going to successfully move the whole economy and the skills base towards a net zero future. And hopefully I can draw on some of that as we go through. So I don't know whether any of you, but I was in Glasgow for COP26. It seems an awful long time ago. It was only in November. And you know, it's worth just reflecting on what was or wasn't achieved there. You know, the conference did reconfirm that goal of limiting average global temperature increases to 1.5 degrees, which is the foundational base of the Paris Agreement. Now, the Paris Agreement basically says that we should aim for 1.5 degrees or well below 2 degrees, so not 2 degrees, but well below that. I think, you know, it's fair to say that, you know, and I'll show you some examples in a moment, where, you know, it's increasingly unlikely that we will get 1.5 degrees, certainly by 2050, without other aspects and technologies and emissions removal technologies having a significant role. But you know, the conclusion was that this could still be in reach. There has been a strengthening of national commitments. So within the Paris Agreement, there's a requirement for NDCs. NDC stands for Nationally Determined Contributions. It's the contribution that every country will make towards reducing their emissions of greenhouse gases. And they have to submit those to the UNFCCC process, UN Framework Commission on Climate Change, and also as part of that, there's a ratchet mechanism by which the ambition should be leveraged upwards, not downwards. And it's fair to say that although there were a strengthening of national commitments, it's still not sufficient to keep that overall goal of 1.5 degrees definitely within sight. So although they state that we want to achieve it, actually, if you add up all the measures, we're not going to get there. Finance has been a really important one. So many Western countries, including the UK, the US, for example, have used a significant portion of the overall carrying capacity of the Earth's atmosphere in terms of greenhouse gases from prior industrialization. And therefore, there's a question of both the loss and damage and equity for other countries in being able to make the transition and to protect themselves for the climate change which is already baked into our system. That finance package was supposed to be $100 billion a year, US dollars, and we're not achieving that yet. And so there is a big credibility gap between what countries have signed up to in terms of Western countries and the richer world actually fulfilling their commitments to more vulnerable countries. So there is a mechanism and a plan to get that back on track by 2025 with enhanced payments prior to that from 2023, such that on average by 2025 you will be able to say there have been 100 billion a year. At a time with kind of inflation going up, then that's eroded as well. An important thing that was achieved was the finalization of what's called the Paris Rulebook. So although you have the Paris Agreement, which sets out the mechanisms for how countries should not just reduce their emissions, but account for it, and what other mechanisms are in play, there was a big gap in terms of what's called Article 6, which was for non-state actors and the role of carbon markets in being able to play a role. That's now been closed off and finalized, so you know the rule book is now complete. And you know, I think definitely this last point is absolutely critical. We need to focus not just on the ambition, so warm words and long-term commitments, but it's actually translating this into action on the ground and rapidly reducing emissions, and that's where the focus of attention and action needs to be. So a summary of where we are, and this is from the Climate Action Tracker website. I've put the URL in the bottom there, well worth having a look at. And what they do is they pull together all of the commitments from the various countries and then plot those onto whether or not we are currently on target, or whether with the commitments that we have in train are likely to keep us within that 1.5 degree Paris Agreement goal. So if I waggle my cursor, you can see here that currently we've experienced around about 1.2 degrees warming compared to the baseline year, and at the moment the policies and actions that are actually in place would take us to round about 2.7 degrees, with a margin of error which could be as high as 3.6 degrees if everything that was in place at the moment delivered as is kind of stated, or possibly 2 degrees. So, but you know, somewhere around 2.7 degrees, and yet, you know, the aim is to get us to down here 1.5 degrees. The most optimistic we would get is if all of the targets that were announced, without the measures and the long-term strategies and INDCs, etc., all came to fruition and were successful in being properly implemented, that by the end of 2100, we would, or by the year 2100, we would still have this 1.5 degrees in reach, but more likely pushing 1.8 and 2. And then you also have basically some other assessments and evaluations. So 2030 is really important because the more quickly that we can reduce our emissions, the more likely it is that we can hold global temperatures in check. If we carry on emitting quite highly into the 2030, then it makes it very unlikely that we can hit this 1.5 or well below 2 degrees, 1.8 going forward. So, and I think this is probably best exemplified here in this other one from Climate Action Tracker, which is looking at this 2030 gap. So here's where we are now, and you can see where the policies and actions that we currently have in train get us to. But if we really want to make a big shift downwards and get ourselves to towards this 1.5 degree world, then we have to rapidly reduce in the next 10, 15, 20 years maximum our emissions. Otherwise, we end up locking ourselves into higher emissions trajectories, higher temperature trajectories, which will then, you know, have significant consequences. And last summer, there was the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report on the physical climate science, and it's a synthesis from all the latest research, which came up with which is done every 5 years, these synthesis reports. And basically the report for policymakers was very unambiguous that climate change is happening. It is attributed to human activity. It is possible with a high degree of confidence to attribute the severe weather events that we are seeing. So, for example, the terrible flooding that we had in China, or in Western Europe, in Germany and Belgium, for example, or the heat dome where we saw temperature records being smashed by nearly 5 degrees, completely unheard of, in North America, are with a high degree of confidence attributable to climate change. And it's the magnitude of those weather events and the pace or the size of them and how quickly we have seen them linked to climate change, which is particularly concerning. So we do expect to see more extreme weather events as a result of the climate change, which is already baked in, and the emissions profiles that we have over the next 10 years will in a large part determine how likely it is that we can achieve our longer term climate goals. So that's the kind of the need for action and the urgency with which we've got to transition to a net zero future. Turning to the UK, we have had since 2008 the Climate Change Act, which puts in a series of carbon budgets, and those budgets are in 5-yearly groups. So we currently have the 6th carbon budget set. So there'll always be carbon budgets at least 15 years into the future to give an element of predictability and certainty for businesses in order to know what's going to have to be achieved in different sectors, etc. And so we have a 68% emissions reduction. In that 78% emissions reduction compared to 1990 for our 6th carbon budget, which runs from the period 2033 to 2037. And we have carbon budgets, in 5-yearly prior cycles. At the moment, we have been hitting our carbon budgets, but it becomes tougher to hit them as we go further forward. The net zero strategy is the government's overarching strategy and plan about how we're going to hit that 6th carbon budget. And that 6th carbon budget is consistent with 1.5 degrees in the Paris Climate Agreement. So that sets out what we need in terms of the power sector. The power sector is the one where we've seen the most significant emissions reductions, largely as a result of the significant growth in renewable energy, particularly from offshore wind, but also some onshore solar, hydro, etc., and bio fuel. There's a big issue around fuel supply and hydrogen. We've got industrial emissions, we've got heat and building transport. Those that come from agriculture as well have got to be part of this. And then there's the question of what we do about whether we use greenhouse gas removals. And I've got a slide in a moment which will kind of speak to this. So we have a fairly, well, it's a high level, but plan for the whole economy. In some ways, it's fair to say that the UK is leading the world in having a long-term, well, a robust governance framework in terms of the Climate Change Act, about an independent body that provides advice to government and parliament about how fast we need to reduce our emissions and what sort of trajectory we need to be on, and actually having legally binding carbon budgets with a clear sense that there has to be linked to that and a requirement in law that there is a plan to achieve those. So, so far we've been hitting them. So that's, positive. I think what we find is when you look around the world, there are very, very few countries that have the level of detailed cross-economy plan that the UK has. So that's where, there needs to be a lot more work done to really move the dial in reducing emissions and doing that very quickly. Here you'll see what that decarbonisation plan starts to look like based on the UK's net zero strategy. What you will see is that the power sector, so I mentioned the power sector, actually now doesn't account for the big bulk of emissions. That's because of the renewables taking coal off the system, some gas, but there is a plan to phase out quite a lot of the gas by 2035. And so what you see here is the power sector emissions continuing to fall. There's big investment in the North Sea, in offshore wind, something like 4 times the amount of power from offshore wind by 2030 compared to 2020. But you can see here the big challenges are about domestic transport. They're around heat and buildings, elements of industrial consumption, and then agriculture, land use change and forestry. That's what that acronym stands for. So you can see where the big activity has to happen. Worth noting that international aviation and shipping also has a role to play, but generally, aviation is about 2% of global emissions, so it's an important one to deal with, but there are many other sources where there has to be a significant reduction. you can see where if we are delivering on the plan, we get to an element where we need to be and where we end up, there's a gap, and that gap has to be then filled by greenhouse gas removals, either through a combination of carbon sequestration in the natural environment. So there is quite an extensive plan underway to enhance UK peatlands and also kind of tree planting and woodland planting and soil protection and enhancement, which is, you know, a significant a significant carbon sink. So extending our carbon sinks while rapidly reducing emissions is the trajectory that we need to go on. So now, just, you know, so if that's the very, very high level plan, and, you know, it's fair to say that some of the sector groups that we're working with are developing specific net zero pathways and transition plans for their sectors. So British Retail Consortium, or the water sector, water industry, or the extractives, Make UK, and others have in place or are developing their plans about how they, as more detailed sectors under these, are going to fulfill their obligations in terms of reducing emissions. So that's kind of underway. But this recognition that this is going to require significant change is something that links then into people. And so there's a lot of work around green jobs and green skills, and it's probably worth us just distinguishing between the two. So green jobs, a couple of definitions here. So one is from the Department for Business's Green Jobs Report, Task Force Report, which published last year, where they define a green job as one which is used to signify employment in an activity that directly contributes to or indirectly supports the achievements of the UK's net zero emissions target and other environmental goals such as nature restoration, mitigation against climate risks. So that's really important. Firstly, just recognise that it's not just net zero. The Environment Act introduces a lot more legally binding targets on air quality, on biodiversity, on water, and resource efficiency and waste. So we've got, you know, collectively some significant environment and climate challenges that we face, and we need to step up to the mark and drive change. So some of those jobs could be, for example, well, kind of my job. The members of IEMA would fall very much into green jobs, but equally so would people who are, you know, involved in installing and working in the renewables sector, or in waste and resources management, or in flood risk planning, etc. Interestingly, on the ILO one here, green jobs reduce the consumption of energy and raw materials, limit GHGs, minimise waste and pollution, etc. In addition, green jobs have to be decent, and, you know, I think there is a recognition as well that as we go through the transition of the economy and the jobs within the economy, there's still this need to provide people with decent employment. And so that's one of the factors that certainly is of interest to the ILO. And you might have come across the phrase, the just transition. So, you know, we know that in the transition to a net zero future, there will be some of our communities which will not be basing their economic activity on things that they're currently doing at the moment. So if you think about, for example, Aberdeen, which is, you know, very, very dependent on North Sea oil and gas, as North Sea oil and gas diminishes, therefore the labour market in places like that will potentially diminish as well. And therefore, how do you create, you know, the jobs of the future that are decent, etc., in communities that are going to be hit by this transition? So not all kind of sectors are going to have a smooth path to the net zero future, and neither will communities. And so there's a lot more thought being given to that, which maybe in the past, you think about miners, hasn't been the case. And I think when you start to look at what the green jobs transition might look like, here's some work that we've been building on, we have a report coming out sometime in March / early April, I think it will come out now, that we're working on with Deloitte, where we looked at the government strategy and what does this mean in terms of jobs and where they might be. So for example, if you look at the power sector, so looking at how we change the grid and the power networks and the way in which we move electricity and power around the system. Obviously, there's the investment in offshore wind, onshore wind, a lot more on storage and demand side flexibility. So what's the role of battery technology in the future in terms of the power system? By 2024, we see about 60,000 jobs and doubling that by 2030. So you can start to see, and the investment that's going to be put into the power sector by 2037 is about 150 to 270 billion. So a lot of investment needed. A lot of that will be needed anyway, whether we were on a net zero transition or not. But the types of jobs and where those jobs will be, understanding where that is really important. Similarly, when we're looking at fuel supply and hydrogen, question mark about what do we do about aviation fuel? What's the role of the UK in terms of a hydrogen economy? So, there's quite a lot of activity going around in terms of pilots about hydrogen, how it can be generated. Is it generated in terms of blue hydrogen from gas or green hydrogen from renewables? And what might its role be in different parts of the economy? Will it be used at all in heating and domestic heating? Question mark. Will it be used in transport? Possibly in some situations. So a lot happening there, and you can see, mobility, the move to electric vehicles. There's both a lot of work going on into battery technology, gigafactories, British Bolt up in the northeast, etc., Coventry, but also then in the infrastructure that's needed to support the electrification of mobility and transport, so charging stations, etc. So again, another significant investment, and so you can kind of look out. So there are a lot of green jobs that are going to be created. Understanding where they are, how to then support that, really, really important. I think there's a difference though between green jobs and green skills. So, when we talk about green jobs, we know what they might be, and we can start to plot them. But the reality is that all jobs are going to have to be done in a greener way if we're going to make this transition, because every organisation might not be classed as being part of the green economy, but nevertheless is going to have to operate in a net zero future, and it's going to have to embed this greener working as a mindset, as a basis on which they operate. And so understanding what different roles in organizations might have to do to make that transition, looking at that from a combination of their knowledge, awareness and understanding to fulfill roles, or the technical skills and capabilities that might be needed, the behaviors and attitude and mindset that might need to come into this, and the competencies required to perform the role in a sustainable way. So looking at that, then it flows through into all different job families and job roles. When we look at transition shifts, we're looking at 4 key areas. So one is that existing specialist roles are likely to kind of grow in terms of number and type. So sustainability managers. If you look at LinkedIn at the moment, it's one of the most one of the areas where there is the fastest kind of growth in people both with those skills and also jobs that are being advertised, simply because the finance sector is looking at how it embeds the net zero transition into their financial planning and investment strategies, and what the dependencies might be from companies that they invest in or lend money to, and whether they're going to be part of the future green, or an economy which is green and sustainable in the future, net zero, or are they a potential liability, and therefore you might want to question whether how exposed you are to them. So there's a kind of a big demand for people with sustainability skills to go into the financial services sector. There'll be a lot more around the transition to a circular economy, in terms of materials and the way in which we use materials in the economy and society, so kind of recycling jobs and all the rest of it. So there will be an expansion of those. There's obviously going to be a transition away from certain sectors, so oil rig and marine engineers, coal miners, kind of those that are heavily dependent on fossil fuels, which over time will phase out. So if you think about electric vehicles, electric vehicles, 100% electric vehicles don't have spark plugs, they don't have exhaust systems, they don't have catalytic converters. So we know that there are certain sector jobs and organizational types and sectors that won't exist in anything like the same kind of meaningful scale as they are at the moment, and so we will be transitioning out of those. So there's going to be a transition shift there. There's going to be a really important one, is this increased need for green skills in non-specialist roles. So whatever type of organization you work for, your product designers are going to have to do design with the net zero transition in mind. So how do you, partly because in some ways it's going to be regulated, in other ways it's going to be a consideration for consumers and customers, and so building that into existing job roles. Similarly with procurement, the whole procurement function needs to understand embedded carbon emissions going forward. Logistics managers, how do we kind of ensure that our logistics are net zero, etc. And then there's probably kind of new roles that are going to be created. So talks about hydrogen. If you are running a hydrogen plant, then kind of potentially new jobs being created. Carbon capture and storage has a potentially important role going forward, and therefore there will be new jobs that are created that don't exist at the moment. The similar heat pump installers, particularly if we're going to be deploying those on all new homes that are built from 2025, for example. So a big shift going in terms of green jobs and green skills, and with that then we need to think about how we support people in terms of education. I think one of the things then is, how do you start to develop that internal capability in your organization, and where does it need to be? This is a very simplified version of a maturity matrix that we're in the process, we've developed and just waiting to publish, which will help organizations to start to plan this transition, both in terms of where you are on a journey from understanding that this is important to developing your organization's capacity and capability to make change, to actually doing that and then becoming a leader in it, and whether your management has the capability and your board leadership has that capability to understand how to drive this through the organization, or your procurement, product design, your accountants, and how you're going to report on this, what it might mean in terms of operational delivery, etc. So you can go down different job families and start to plot out where you are and where you might need to be. And what we do is, in this work package that we've been involved in, that we'll be publishing shortly, we'll have a model organization which sets out for different job families what are the knowledge, skills, behaviors and competencies needed in different job families to be able to ensure that your organization is fit for the future. And we provide indications of where we think those jobs are now, job families are now in terms of environment and sustainability capability, where they need to be by 2030 and where they might need to be by 2050. So understanding how much they're going to have to shift in terms of the way in which those jobs are performed, in order to give your organization the capability. So I think that will be quite important going forward, to see both where you are organizationally, but then where individual job roles fit in. Of course, when you've identified that, the question is, how do you fill those gaps? And just to give an indication of how challenging, of how the challenges might manifest themselves. So I've taken this from the Future Homes Hub, which is the transition for how houses of the future, what do we expect from them in terms of their sustainability? So what we know is that in terms of those homes, they need to be zero carbon ready. So they need to be really incredibly efficient in the way in which they use water, because we have, you know, all the future projections are that we will have all parts of England will be in a water deficit situation by 2050 if we don't do things differently. They also need to be able to, you know, those homes need to be able to probably generate their own power in terms of solar. They need to be able to charge an electric vehicle. They need to be able to swap electricity between a vehicle and the home. They need to be, as I mentioned, really water efficient. They need to be flood resilient. They need to be, new requirement is that they've got to be biodiversity net gain when they are built. They need to be, we need to look at the materials that the homes are built with and the construction processes. We need to look at the things that are going to go into homes. So suddenly you can see how pulling that all together in terms of an overall plan, then you can start to say, okay, well, what are the changes that this sector needs to go through to deliver that? Some of it they can do on their own in terms of house builders. Some of it they've got to work with other sectors such as the power sector, the mobility sector, the water sector, etc., or the construction products sector, to be able to make this transition and then work out what are the skills and jobs that are needed to be able to do this, and then plot that pathway. So that's all underway at the moment in terms of this particular sector and this type of activity, but it has to happen across the whole economy. So what does that mean? Well, embedding across skills across the economy, it means that we do need to look at this in the context of the whole education curriculum, right from early years through to secondary school, into colleges and sixth forms, etc., then into further education and universities. It's about providing information in terms of clear career pathways for people to all entry points into employment. So if you're going to be working in installation of heat pumps, you know, what are the technologies and the techniques and the capabilities that you need to develop to do that, versus going into the hydrogen economy, which might be some higher level skills. There is going to be this key role for apprenticeships, partly because the apprenticeship levy provides a source of your own company's funding, which you need to use or lose. I think that's really important going forward. We're seeing that happen now. Work to try and green apprenticeships as well as provide more green apprenticeships is underway. So it's interesting, we've got now a level 7 sustainability business specialist, which is a master's in sustainability. People are going to be working in sustainability roles. Provides the opportunity for people who are already in the world of work to get a funded master's course where you would still be working in your role. You do that part-time and you get £11,000 towards the cost of that master's. And there are degree apprenticeships as well. And then this lifelong learning, because 80% of the 2030 workforce is already in employment. So there's not just new people coming into the world of work, but it's how we provide the opportunity to enhance the skills and capability of existing workforces as well as we go through this transition. So there's a lot to do. So that comes to the end of my slides. I'm going to close my presentation down because then I can see everything that I need to see, I think. And happy then to take any questions or comments.
Many thanks, Martin, for such an interesting and informative presentation. We do have a few questions, which I'll read out to you. We are a small organisation with a small number of employees, so how best do we move towards net zero?
So I think I will put it in the chat actually, but if you go to the Zero Carbon Business Hub, we've been involved in a program of activity to give an opportunity for organisations, particularly SMEs, to make net zero step up to the net zero challenge. So you can, if you go onto that website, zerocarbonbusiness. I can't remember off the top of my head. I will find it while I'm talking. if you go onto that website, what you will find is that there is a whole set of resources that are available. You can put in, so the website is zerocarbonbusiness.uk. If you go onto that website, you can click to get to net zero at the top, and it will give you an indication of how an organisation in your sector might make that transition, and give you an outline plan. So that's how I would suggest you do it, or you make the initial steps. What I would say is that it's definitely, well, and I'm bound to say this, isn't it? Is part of this is going to be about getting the capability to make that change. So there are lots of training and education programs. IMA has got them, but I'm sure that others have as well. So internal capability, your organisation, if you understand about net zero and what it might mean, and the wider changes that are coming, then you can start to put in the systems and that your organisation might need to be able to be successful in the future.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, as an HSE manager, do you have any qualifications that I can take to enhance my knowledge?
Yes, so the IMA Foundation Certificate in Environmental Management would certainly help. You can, if you go to the IMA website, so www.ima.net, if you click on training there, you will be able to see a range of both courses that can help you, and also different course providers who offer that. Some of it can be classroom delivered, some can be virtual classrooms and learning. So there are ways in which you can access that, the content of those programs in ways which are flexible for you, and they're delivered not just here in the UK but internationally as well.
Okay, thank you. A sort of similar question is how do we find training for people within our organisation to increase their green skills? Would that be at the same place, same points?
Yeah, so if you go to the IMA website, we do have skills programs for raising awareness and understanding across the whole organisation, and some of our corporate partners have been using that and training and upskilling their whole workforce or different parts of their workforce using those tools. So yeah, you should be able to find them on our website there.
That's great, thank you. What are the first steps an organisation should take to ensure it has the capability to make the net zero transition?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things you need to do is to start to understand what your existing capabilities are. So start to think about, how much do people understand about sustainability in their roles. So plot that on maybe a little, I gave you an outline of, have we got basic understanding? Have we got high level of understanding? What might we expect is needed in a different job family? And start to list out your job families, and then you can start to think about where there might be gaps, and then you can start to say, well, what interventions would help? So whether it's carbon literacy programs, which might be important, it might be that you need to focus on your procurement because that's something where you've got a particular focal point or interest or pressure, then you can start to kind of map that out. So I think understanding where your existing competencies are and where they aren't, and then you can start to come up with a plan.
Okay, thank you. And how do you prioritise where to focus upskilling activities?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, in part, it depends on your organisation, but what we found is that, if you prioritise the leaders and get their buy-in and support, then it makes the rest of what you need to do in your organisation move that much more quickly, and unlocks the resources for the rest of the organisation. And certainly we're seeing, whether it's the Cabinet Office's procurement notes on climate change, which basically require organisations to have a net zero plan and transition plan in order to bid for public contracts over £5 million. That can kind of concentrate the minds. Increasingly, banks and lenders are asking about your net zero plans and transitions, so your availability to access funding could be important. So there are some important drivers which might stimulate the people at the top of your organisation to then think they need to understand more. And by them understanding more, they'll understand what else needs to happen in their organisation. So probably prioritise the people at the top if you can.
Okay, thank you. And you mentioned their funding. Are there funding opportunities to support green skills development?
There are some, yeah. I mentioned apprenticeships because there are some very specific apprentice roles which are for people who are either newly coming into the workforce or who are already there. I mentioned the sustainability business specialist. There's an environmental practitioner degree program. There are some CSR apprenticeships as well. All of those you can start to unlock your apprenticeship levy funding pots to support the learning that might happen. There's also access to some funding through, for example, some of the programs that the Chambers of Commerce are running. So in Lancashire, I know they've had a program called their Chamber Low Carbon program, which gives you support to enhance the capabilities of people in your areas. So I think if you start to look around, there are funding opportunities either through local enterprise partnerships, through Chambers of Commerce, etc., as well as your apprenticeships, which you can use to help to green your workforce.
That's great. Thank you very much, Martin. We don't seem to have any more questions. If anybody has got any more questions to ask, please just pop it now into the question box. I'll give you a couple of a minute or two just to see if we've got any more questions to come through. No, that seems to be all of the questions for this afternoon. So I think we'll thanks again, Martin, for sharing your knowledge with us today. And thank you to everybody that's joined us as well. Just a brief reminder from me that the recording will be on the YouTube channel either later today or in the morning, so you'll be able to catch up or recap on anything in your own time. Thanks once again, Martin, for giving up your time this afternoon with your presentation. Enjoy the rest of your day, everybody, and I'm now going to end the webinar. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.